Hi there, Jonathan Fields with Good Life Project. So my guest today is Dan Pink. Dan is an author of a number of incredible books that I started out with, A Whole New Mind, Drive, which really explores the science of motivation, and his latest book, which is all about selling, which we're going to really dive into and explore how that relates to actually your exploration of a life well lived. So awesome to be hanging out with you today, Dan.
Jonathan, it's great to be here.
So I want to actually talk about your current work because it's really fascinating to me on a lot of different levels, but I also want to talk a little bit about you before we go there and your journey.
My favorite topic.
Fabulous. We'll start with the honorary bow. You graduated law school.
I did.
Went to Yale Law School, but from my understanding, you never practiced.
I never practiced law a day in my life, no.
Did you ever intend to? I'm always curious because I'm a former lawyer. I practiced for a short amount of time.
Yeah, it's kind of weird. I mean, I think I went to law school because I didn't have anything better to do, and it's sort of something that was always.
I think a lot of people do that.
It was always, but for me, it was something I was always kind of intending to do. Like, actually, in a weird way, I never thought about not going, which is kind of peculiar.
Come from a family of lawyers?
No, not at all. I just come from a family of paranoid middle class people who think their kids should have something to fall back on, and so that was, I think, the main impetus. And so it wasn't really a well-reasoned decision at all, and I had a kind of a circuitous path through law school, and when I finally realized what lawyers actually did, I thought, okay, you get someone to do that for you, and then so you can do the interesting stuff. And so, but I was so risk averse, I didn't bother to leave altogether, and I did end up taking the bar, but I never practiced law a day in my life.
So your next move from law school then was what?
I started working in politics.
So that was like straight out of law school?
Straight out of law school, yeah. I started working in political campaigns, and that was great. That was totally cool and exhilarating and fun. And at the time, I was much less so now. I was way into politics. It was something that was really deeply interesting to me, deeply meaningful to me. And so to go into the belly of the beast in that way was really cool and interesting. And political campaigns are really great on a number of levels because they're projects, and they have a beginning, they have a middle, they have an end, they have an outcome. They're intense, but they don't last forever. So to me, it's almost in some ways the ideal kind of project.
Right, which is kind of funny because you said you weren't the entrepreneurial person, you had to know what was coming next, but it's almost like you're a series of ventures that you're launching, going, and you have no idea if it's going to work or not.
Totally, that's exactly what it is. And so that's kind of fun, that's kind of exhilarating.
Right.
And then I did that for a while, and then I ended up working not so much in still in politics, at the juncture of politics and government as a speechwriter for several years. And then I just became, maybe not strangely, became completely totally disenchanted with politics.
Was there something that happened, or was it sort of?
No, it wasn't like a single instance. It was just an accumulation of things. Because as I got further into it, as I got further into seeing what was actually going on, I guess some of my idealism or naivete started melting away, and I said, this is not quite what I thought. I'm not sure whether this is the venue to do good, to have an impact on people's lives. And then as someone who has been kind of a writer, kind of sort of on the side for a long time, if you're a speech writer, I think you're not writing your own stuff. You're writing for somebody else.
Right.
You're writing in the voice of somebody else.
So you're always in their head.
Exactly. And I think at a certain point, if you keep doing that, you lose sight of what you think. And I found that a little bit terrifying. And so I left.
Yeah, I mean, I never thought about it that way, but it would make a lot of sense. I mean, it was interesting too. As a lawyer, before I was only practicing for about 4 years, but in the first 2.5, 3 years, I was in the government. So I was always I was like, okay, I am the voice of the United States government. When we were in court and stuff like that. And it's interesting because it's like you've got this split personality thing going on.
Although that's interesting. That's actually an interesting point because I mean there's something positive about that as well. This idea of representing the United States is actually really important. One of the things that is interesting about speechwriting is that it is a form of advocacy. So you actually have a much more, I was working for Vice President Gore, so you have a much more powerful, amplified voice, so that's great. And one of the reasons though I was able to leave my job, and finally after years of whining and years of uncertainty about what my path was, should I do this, should I do that, was I really a writer, blah blah blah. One reason I was able to leave my job is that my wife was a government lawyer. My wife was a lawyer for the Justice Department, and she had a salary and she had health insurance. So the husband could leave and try to do his own thing and see whether it worked out. But one of the things that she found exhilarating about her job, now, exhilarating isn't quite the right word. One of the things that she found meaningful in her job was that of saying, you know, here's, on this side is Joe Schmatz representing the Schmatz Corporation, and on this side is Jessica Lerner representing the United States of America.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool.
It is pretty cool.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a little bit terrifying. You feel the weight of the responsibility when you step into a courtroom.
Which is a good thing, I think.
It
I
is.
mean, you want to feel like you are.
I agree.
Yeah.
I mean, you want to feel like you need to do the right thing.
Yeah.
You know, because you're acting on behalf of
the United States of America.
I mean, that's a big client.
Yeah.
But so you go from a place where, you know, like you're deep into politics. You're working with Al Gore, who's the then vice president, and then complete departure from that. Your wife is working at the time, so she becomes then at that point the sole breadwinner for the family?
Yeah, until I started winning some bread.
What's that like?
It was fine. It was good. The path was less stark than that. I know that you're interested in, I mean, and as I am too, you know, interested in people's paths. The path was less black and white than at some level I'm making it out to be. When I was working in politics, and even when I was in law school, I was always writing articles on the side.
Okay.
I was writing magazine articles, I was writing op-eds for newspapers and so forth, just because it was what I wanted to do. I didn't think like, oh, this is what I'm going to do with my life. It's just that, hey, this is kind of fun. I like to do this. It's meaningful to me. And so even when I was in some of these jobs that were extremely demanding, I would be, you know, up at 11 o'clock at night, midnight, working on an article on the side. And in certain government jobs that I had, most government jobs that I had, I couldn't earn any money for it. So I was basically doing this stuff for free.
Right.
And so at a certain point, not being very quick on the uptake, I realized, you're up at midnight doing something for free.
Right.
Maybe this is what you should be doing. And so
Light bulbs
and
go
so
off.
as that so it was kind of a slow transition there. And Jessica, my wife, you know, knew that I was not unhappy, but just dissatisfied in that particular role. And so, you know, as a family, we talked about, okay, what should we do about this? And we decided to give it a roll. And the thing is, I don't want to portray it as this kind of bold, headlong plunge into a risky world at all. It was much more deliberate, much more calculated. The idea was, hey, let me try this, see if I can write on my own for a couple of years, see if it works. If it works, we'll keep doing it. If it doesn't work, we'll figure out another plan. You know, I'll go get a job.
Right. Yeah, and it's kind of fascinating because we have some parallels just in sort of like the way things have unfolded. I spent more time in entrepreneurship after that and then moved into the world of writing. But it was always a thread with me also. And there came a similar point where I'm like, okay, this is the thing where I keep turning to it and I'm doing it. And I'm doing it to help other people and I'm writing here and I'm writing there.
Right. Well, it's interesting. I mean, one of the things our mutual friend Gretchen Rubin helped sort out for me in a conversation once, where people like to ask other people, "What's your passion?" And I freaking hate that question. All right, that question drives me nuts because I kind of tense up in it because I have to give a really good answer.
Right.
And I think that's a less useful question than basically taking a step back and saying, "What do you do?" Okay. How do you spend your time? What do you do? And and I wasn't doing that. And when I take a step back, certainly in retrospect, I say, "Hello, you're trying to tell yourself something." And finally, I listen to myself. But this is after, I'm not joking around. This is after like 12 or 15 years of not listening to myself.
I totally get it, but that's how long. I mean, for a lot of people, they never. It's 20, 30, 40, 50 years, and they actually never
that's
hit
true.
that
That's
point.
true. Yeah.
It's funny. I have this same knee-jerk reaction to the question about passion also, and I've had this conversation with so many people. And because I think also it becomes this huge barrier because people are like, well, I have to know my passion or else I can't actually.
Right.
People generally don't think that way. I mean, one of the questions that I ask people, it freaks people out if I'm meeting them for the first time these days, is some variation of, like, so what's holding your interest now?
Yeah.
I don't really care. I care what people actually care about.
Yeah.
And that tends to be the key to, like, what do you do when nobody's watching or when you can just do what you want to do?
Precisely.
And that kind of like track that back.
Precisely. And also even the word, not to go crazy on this, not to take the word passion and just pound it with mallets for the next 10 minutes, but even the word itself doesn't quite capture what why people do what they do, particularly as they try to follow their path, as they try to do the work. Because passion is a very kind of, is a hot emotion, and we do experience hot emotions, but what sustains us are emotions that are, I guess, not super hot, more kind of room temperature, because they're calibrated to who we are, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so you don't want to be turned up the heat, you don't want to have the heat turned up all the way all the time, you'll burn out.
Right, it's not sustainable.
Right, and so what you want is you want an emotion that's sustaining, and those emotions, the emotions that are sustaining tend to be things like meaningfulness, a sense of intrinsic interest, the experience of flow at certain points, the feeling that you're making a contribution, and those are not hot emotions, those are actually more calm emotions, but those are a source of incredible renewable energy.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, we can go on that path for a long time, but I want to kind of zoom the lens forward. You've written some really powerful books.
Thanks.
And that have really shifted the way that I view how people contribute to the world and what they get from it and why we do what we do. Your new book is really fascinating to me because I've been an entrepreneur for a lot of years now and a copywriter, and I've studied persuasion and influence because it's great for business, but also just because I'm the geek at the beach who's reading a social science book because it's just fascinating.
Sure.
So so the new book is all about sort of like selling and how the world is changing around selling, and a lot of mythology around this. And I want to get into some of the big points here. So you have a new book out, and the name of the book is To Sell is Human. Why this book?
A lot of reasons. There are basically two big reasons. One of them is that I've spent the last 15 years or so writing about work. So I'm kind of obsessed. If there's something I'm obsessive about, it's work, understanding work, why people work, what people do, what it means to them. And at a certain point, a few years ago, I said, okay, so you have these weeks where you feel like you're doing stuff, but you're not sure exactly what you did. And so I went back and sort of did this because I'm anal retentive about certain kinds of things, and said, okay, what did I actually do the last 2 weeks? And so I looked at my calendar and I tried to unpack everything that I did. I looked at my sent emails, which is just a freaking mess. And I looked at, I tweet a lot, so I looked at what tweets I sent and all that sort of stuff. And when I analyzed this stuff, I said, holy smokes, and I say holy smokes because I'm from Ohio. I said, holy smokes, I am a salesman. I'm spending so much of my time basically persuading, influencing, cajoling, and I didn't even realize I was doing it. I was doing it at work. So a magazine editor says, hey, this is a great story. You're the perfect person for the story. We want you to do the story. It's a terrible idea. And so, but it's not, you can't say that's the worst idea I've ever heard. You have to come up with a more elegant way to explain why that's a terrible idea and why there's no way on God's green earth I would ever do it. If you think about even in when you're traveling, it's like, oh God, I'm kind of restless, so I don't like having window seats in airplanes. So it's like, okay, can I get the gate agent to switch me from a window seat to an aisle seat? And how do I go about making that case? My wife and I have 3 kids, and our youngest kid is a baseball player, and being a 9-year-old, now 10-year-old boy, he doesn't like to, bathe all that much. And so it's like, okay, man, you got to take a shower after baseball practice because you're filthy. How do you? And so I'm like, oh my God, I am a salesman. And it kind of freaked me out a little bit. And I said, I basically recognized that I have no idea how to do this. I'm doing something that I have no idea how to do.
But even back when you were writing speeches too, I mean, fundamentally, it's sales.
It's sales. It is. I mean, and what's interesting there is that if you think, one way that I define sales is essentially trying to convince someone else to part with resources in exchange for something that you have. Okay, so it could be money, money for goods. That's one kind of exchange. But in speeches and something, the exchange is essentially attention. Pay attention. Right. Listen to me. And so that was one impetus. The other impetus was this book that I wrote called Drive, and that book argues that we've oversold carrot and stick motivators. That carrot and stick motivators don't work nearly as well as we think, and a different set of motivators works better. In particular, there was this class of motivators that I call if-then rewards. If you do this, then you get that. And I was arguing that those don't work that well based on 50 years of science. Those are pretty good for simple tasks, not so good for complex tasks. And in response to that book, people emailed me and said, okay, so you might be right, but what about salespeople? They're all on commission. And I'm like, oh God, how did I not think of that? And I started hearing from some salespeople, some companies saying, we read this book, it's really interesting. I thought you might like to know that I recently eliminated commissions from my sales force and saw sales go up. And whoa, that's kind of interesting. So I started writing about that. And then, so the combination of things, it said, I'm basically spending all my time in some form of sales. This world of sales is actually quite interesting, but I knew nothing about it. And then you go over here and you realize business schools don't teach it. What was it, about 50 MBA programs that I looked at, I think it was 4 or 5 actually taught sales. As if making the cash register ring is incidental to commerce in some way. And if you look at the books on sales, most of them are 41 ways to close the deal, 16 steps to power selling, all about
kind of like very old school
sleazy hoodwinkery. And I said, hey, let's try this because it's something that I think is really interesting.
So, and one of the things and you've alluded to it, when you're talking about selling, it's a much broader category than most people associate with.
Yeah. Well, and again, I try to be as analytical about this as I possibly can. So let's look at the numbers. And there are a lot of myths about sales, as you mentioned. And one of them is this myth that the internet has obliterated salespeople, has disintermediated. That's the phrase that pays if you're a consultant. Has disintermediated salespeople. We've got Expedia, Amazon, all these websites.
Right.
You don't need any salespeople anymore. Well, if you actually look at the numbers, here's what it shows. In 2000, 1 in 9 American workers was in sales. That is their job. This is sales. Their job was to convince someone else to make a purchase. Real estate agents, people selling computer systems, whatever. 2000, 1 in 9 Americans works in sales. What's happened over the last 12 or 13 years? Widespread broadband, explosion of social media, YouTube, smartphones, tablets, okay, all these disintermediating technologies. 2000, 1 out of 9 Americans worked in sales, a decade of disintermediating technologies. 2013, 1 in 9 Americans works in sales.
Which completely defies logic. I mean, but it doesn't. It does.
It doesn't. Yeah. Right. Well. Yeah. It doesn't defy logic. It defies our conventional view of things.
Exactly.
And so you got 1 in 9 Americans. So this is actually pretty significant. You got 15 million Americans who earn their living trying to get people to buy stuff. Okay, that's a pretty decent size of the American workforce. But I think the other interesting thing is I said, well, what about those other 8 and 9? Because you and I would not be. The way that the Bureau of Labor Statistics would categorize what you and I do, they would not put us in that 1 in 9. But you and I are in sales too.
Fundamentally, yeah.
Okay? And so what I did is, for the first time in any book that I've done, I actually took a few steps in more kind of quantitative research in teasing out some of these ideas. So I went out into the field and we did a pretty sophisticated survey of about 7,000 adult full-time workers in America, asking them a bunch of questions. And one of the questions we asked was this: how much time do you spend trying to convince other people to exchange resources, part with resources, time, attention, money, whatever? And so we had 7,000 adult full-time workers, and the average came back at about 40%. So we have this massive sample.
And across, no matter what your title was, no matter what your role was.
Yeah, that was the average. There were some kind of distinctions within there. The mean was 40%, and what we saw was you had a number of people, a lot of people around maybe 20, but then you had a lot of people who were around 80.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, who were kind of like the super move. I call this whole category moving people, and so you have these super movers over here. So it worked out to an average of about 40. But if you think about that, 40% of one's time. 40% of an hour is 24 minutes. 24 minutes of every hour people are spending doing this. And so if you look at the 1 out of 9 and then the 8 out of 9, the inevitable, inexorable conclusion is that we're all in sales, like it or not.
Right. And you wonder also, like, of those 24 minutes of every hour, if the people that are doing that are ones who don't self-identify as sales and don't really think that they're doing sales until you prompt them to think about what they're actually doing, probably have never been trained in how to do it effectively. How much of that 24 minutes could they shrink down?
A good point, yeah.
If they actually learned how to do this, and how much more time would it free them to?
That's a great. I wish I had thought of that and put it in the book. Seriously, it's a really great point. It makes a lot of sense that that 40%. It could be large because that's a very good point. It could be large because it's inefficient.
Yeah.
And so what you could do is you could end up, as you say, reducing the percentage, which would free up time to do something else.
To contribute in all sorts of other meaningful ways. And it's fascinating too, because I would imagine so many people never thought about, till you prompted this with the research that you did, probably never thought about the fact that they were A, even doing this, or B, doing it that much. Were people surprised when sort of they came back?
A little bit, but the interesting, people did have an inkling there, because we also asked people to, if they ended up saying that we're spending a decent amount of my time doing this, we had follow-up questions that asked them essentially, how important is it to your career flourishing?
Right.
And people acknowledged that, this is actually pretty important. Now, I'm not sure I think we, to use your word, we prompted them to think about that a little bit, but I think people, once they realize what they're doing, they're saying, this is pretty important. And there are all kinds of interesting reasons for it. One of them is the explosion of entrepreneurs. You see that here in New York City, where we are.
Absolutely.
You have just this, what's interesting is that there's a paradox in a way that the technologies that were supposed to obliterate salespeople turned more of us into sellers. So, Etsy turned a bunch of people into craft sellers. That's one example there. And so you have more people who are in entrepreneurship. That's one reason that's happening. The other thing, if you look at larger kinds of firms, you have something really peculiar going on in that there's far less segmentation based on function. So it used to be, you did accounting, I did sales, she did marketing, he did operations. Now, when companies are always doing more with less, when the environment is more fluid, people's skills have to be much more elastic. And so I have these weird paradoxical things where, a couple of companies, not giant companies, but big companies, decent sized companies, $300 million in revenue, $100 million. I have one company, $100 million in revenue, another company, $300 million in sales, $250 million a year in sales, that has no salespeople. What? And when you ask them this, they say, well, no one's, it's like dealing with a Zen master. It's like, what? How does this work? Well, nobody's in sales because everybody's in sales. So if you're an engineer, you're in sales by helping the customer. If you are in customer service, you're in sales by helping the customer be served. And so I think what's happening overall is that everybody's realizing they have some kind of sales component, and that's sales. And then when you look at what the anthropology of what goes on inside of a company, people are persuading, convincing, cajoling each other all the time on everything. Whether they're pitching ideas in a meeting, whether they're asking somebody out on a date. That's in some ways what human beings do. And we come into this when we prompt people to stop back and say, you're in sales. Most people recoil at that idea.
Right, because there's such a there's an emotional attachment to the label of being in sales. It's such a negative association.
It is intensely negative. Intensely negative. There was some interesting Gallup data that just came out that showed the regard with which we hold certain professions. Do you think these professions are I think they were ethical and honorable? And second to last was members of Congress. What's always at the top are things like nurses, clergy. Which makes perfect sense, actually, in most cases. Then, so you go further down the list, you got lawyers, further down the list, people in advertising, further down the list. Second to last, members of Congress. Last, car salesmen. Okay? So, and we actually, again, to get at this in an analytic way, again, as part of the survey, 7,000 adult full-time workers in America, we asked this question, it's a cool question. When you think of sales or selling, what's the first word that comes to mind? Okay, so a lot of survey research is on a scale of 1 to 5. Do you agree strongly, neutral, disagree strongly? Okay, so that gets at one dimension of people's views. But what I wanted was something that's a little bit more visceral. When you think of sales or selling, what's the first word that comes to mind? And so we captured, these answers from 7,000 people. And then what I did is I actually ended up taking out the nouns, because some people said marketing, persuasion, basically giving synonyms, which is cool.
Right.
But then I isolated the adjectives. Okay, and I have in the book, I have a word cloud of the top 25 adjectives that people used based on the size of, based on the word being the size of the number of times it was mentioned. And out of those 25 adjectives, I mean, number one, the biggest thing right in the center, pushy.
Right, not flattering words in that word cloud.
21 of them are negative out of the top 25. Pushy, sleazy, smarmy, cheesy, annoying. I mean, so the negative associations with sales are deep and intense, but I also think they're wrong. I think that view of sales, pushy, sleazy, I mean, I like if you look at these words, it's like sleazy, cheesy, and smarmy. They're like the seven dwarfs nobody talks about. I think that view of sales is actually quite outdated, because that view of sales, to me, is less about sales per se and more about the conditions in which sales have long taken place. And what I mean by that is this. Most of what we know about sales, most of what we've been taught about sales, is from a world of information asymmetry. The seller always had more information than the buyer.
Right.
Okay? If I got much more information than you, I can rip you off. So 20 years ago, you walk into a Chevy dealership, the Chevy dealer knew significantly more about Chevys and cars and what things cost and what they should cost than you ever could. So you were in some ways at their mercy. Now we have a stop on that with the way that we navigate the world. We have the principle of caveat emptor, buyer beware. The whole reason we have the principle of buyer beware is because sellers know more and can rip you off. Well, I think what's happened now is, though, that information asymmetry, which defined the sales relationship, is coming closer to information parity.
Completely agree.
And so,
maybe even going beyond that to a certain extent in certain spaces.
That's exactly right. So let's say, I mean, cars are a good example of that. So now, a not insignificant, relatively short time later, you go into the Chevy dealer, you can know, as you're suggesting, more about the car than the dealer does. You can go in there saying, hey, this dealer is charging this dealer is charging this. Oh, and by the way, here's the factory invoice. Here's what you paid for it.
Right.
Now let's talk about buying a car.
And now you can just plug your need in and have like the 10 local salespeople.
You can have them bid against that, which drives the price down. So you can. So what do? They either can compete on price, or they can compete on actually serving you. Right. They can compete on serving you a little bit better. And so in that. Now, the other thing is, in all kinds of realms, it's not only that. So information parity of a sort has replaced information asymmetry. But it's not only that. Buyers have a lot more choices, and they have the means to talk back. So if you do end up ripping me off,
right?
All right. Let's say you do have an information advantage, and you do manage to hoodwink me, and I find that out. I go register the domain jonathanfieldsisAjerk.com, all right? I go tweet it to all my followers. I put it on Facebook.
You need to make a note, make sure I have that reserved.
Right. All right. And so what you have here, and this is a big deal, is that when buyers have as much information as sellers, lots of choices, and the means to talk back, caveat emptor is still good advice, I think, but the other advice is caveat venditor, seller beware. Sellers have to beware. Right. You can't take the low. You can take the low road. You're just not going to be there for very long. Yeah. It's not like the Music Man. Imagine the Music Man today. The Music Man does his little thing, and then he moves to another city, and no one knows who he is. That's not going to work today. And so, in a world of caveat venditor, seller beware, it's not a difference in degree. It's a difference in kind. And so that's what I'm trying to explore in this book: is how do we move people, persuade people, influencing people sell in a world where there's parity between buyers and sellers, in a world of caveat venditor or seller beware. And what it does is it forces us more to the high road, and I think what's interesting is it more to tapping some fundamentally human qualities rather than these kind of acquired manufacturer skills of sleazebaggery and hoodwinkery.
And what's fascinating to me also is, in my experience, it's always been the people who led with service and compassion and were the most ethical people who ended up actually doing the best and having the longest term relationships and
over time. There's no question about that. Yeah.
But there's so much burnout and turnover in that field, and people would just use these like, how can I get money in the bank really fast? and then everybody hates them, they hate themselves, and they go and do something
and
else.
they end up, what they also end up doing is they end up actually polluting the entire stream.
Right, exactly.
And so the people who are operating ethically end up getting polluted by that tag. I think your point is well taken. One of the things that I write about is, okay, so in around 1970, 71, this writer named Robert Greenleaf came up with this idea of servant leadership.
Right.
Okay? And people thought, what? I mean, it was really basically, he's taking the pyramid, turning it upside down. He's saying that what you should do is you should serve first and lead second. That the service actually gave you the authority to lead. All right? Now, that was a weird concept 40 years ago. And now it's actually fairly widely embraced in word, not necessarily in deed all the time. But it's something that people say, yeah, that's actually the good way to do it. Good in the sense of ethical, but also good in the sense of effective. I think what we're seeing now is a move toward what we can think of as servant selling, in that basically your job is to serve first. And serve has different dimensions to it. Serve can be get your pizza in 30 minutes or less. But I also think it's something more transcendent than that. That is, do people leave the transaction better off than when they began?
Right, absolutely.
Does the transaction actually make the world better than when it began? And I think if you start with that sense of the more transcendent sense of service, you're actually better at selling and influencing.
I think you're better at selling and influence, and that's always the space that I've tried to come from. I think you're better at it, but you feel better. You can live with yourself.
Good point, yeah.
So much more easily.
Yeah.
So it's like, yes, you're more effective over time, especially when people can talk back and there's more parity.
Yeah.
You know, your long-term prospects are going to be way better, but
Absolutely.
also you can wake up in the morning
Totally.
feeling good, and you can go to sleep at night feeling like I helped somebody today.
Right.
You know, like my core metrics in the world these days, you know, are outbound its impact and inbound its trust.
Yeah, nice.
You know, so if I'm sitting there and just trying to if I wake up in the morning and my main goal is what can I take, I lose from the time I open my eyes. And I do think that there have been a group of people that have led with that for a lot of years, but I think what you're saying is dead on also, and I love reading about this and the way you phrase it and the research you saw on it, which is that's changing. And even if you were resistant to it and you didn't want to change, you kind of have to now.
Right, I think that's right. That is you basically have two kinds of pressures. The pressure one has always had, which is the basically to abide by a sense of morality and ethics, and sleep well at night and look back on your life when you're much older saying, hey, I did something meaningful and I did it the right way. But I also think that you really don't have much of a choice now.
Right.
And again, and I think that's a fundamentally different approach to selling. And what I try to do is give people, okay, if this is right, or like anything, more right than wrong, how do you get better at this? What are the kinds of abilities, what are the kinds of skills that you need to do this more effectively?
Right. So let's talk about that a little bit, because you talk about, you know, like the old classic ABCs,
Yeah.
always be closing. And you have a new set of sort
Yeah.
of ideals or things that lead.
Yeah,
lead
it's really the qualities that social science shows make us effective in moving other people. And it is the ABCs, from the great scene in the movie Glengarry Glen Ross, where Alec Baldwin goes in and he schools these sad sack sales real estate guys, and he flips over this green chalkboard and says, A, always, B, C, closing, always be closing, always be closing. And I think that steamroller approach is, I mean, we laugh at it, but if anybody came to you sort of trying to steamroller, you say, sorry, dude, and then you would tweet about it.
Right.
All right? And so I think the new ABCs are A, attunement, B, buoyancy, C, clarity. Attunement, buoyancy, and clarity. Attunement is the capacity to take someone else's point of view, to see the world from their perspective. It's a prelude to any kind of service in many ways. B is buoyancy. One of the things that people have a hard time with, and that, you know, seasoned entrepreneurs like you have less of a hard time with because you have the battle scars, is dealing with rejection. In any kind of effort to move someone else, you're going to get rejected. You're going to get rejected a lot. You're going to hear a lot of no's. And most of us don't like hearing no's. We don't like hearing no's if we ask somebody out on a date. We don't like hearing no's if we pitch an idea. We don't like hearing no's if we go to raise money for our company. And yet you have to deal with that.
Yeah.
And buoyancy is the capacity to deal with that. There's one salesperson who I interviewed in the book, comes in a couple of times, this wonderful guy named Norman Hall, who is the last Fuller Brush man.
I love his story.
He's awesome. And it's like the last Fuller Brush man in San Francisco. And he talks about sales when he says every day you confront, it's just a lovely phrase, his phrase, an ocean of rejection. an ocean of rejection. And so buoyancy is how do you stay afloat on that ocean of rejection. And C, clarity. Clarity is the capacity to make sense of murky situations. That's pretty important now because not only do we have information parity of a sort, but we have an explosion of information. So accessing information matters less than curating information. The other thing that I think is really interesting more broadly, and I think it goes both to business skills and to personal skills, is the move from problem solving to problem finding. Today, if somebody knows precisely what their problem is, I need this kind of light bulb for this kind of fixture, they can find the answer on their own. They don't need a salesperson, okay? Where salespeople are more valuable is when people don't know what their problem is. And so people who can go in and help find latent problems. No, your real problem is X, Y, or Z. That's really important. And so problem solving is very much an analytic skill. Problem finding is very much an artistic skill. And then there's some really cool stuff about how do you frame messages in ways that are persuasive. So it's A, attunement, B, buoyancy, C, clarity. I can't do it with the kind of animal zeal that Alec Baldwin did it, but that's the idea.
Man, I love that shift, and I think people are experiencing it, like we've said, whether they want to or not. That's the nature of where persuasion, influence, sales is sort of going these days. Something pops into my head. There are two questions, really. One is, what about introverts?
Oh, good question, yeah. What about introverts? Well, here's the thing. So we have this idea out there that extroverts make the best salespeople. Okay, pretty clear why. They're gregarious, they're comfortable with people, and so if you look at the research, extroverts are more likely to get hired as salespeople. Extroverts are more likely to go into sales. Extroverts are more likely to get promoted in sales jobs. We run into a problem though, because if you look at the link between extroversion and sales performance, how often the cash register rings, how much revenue piles up. The link between extroversion and sales performance is essentially zero. Whoa, wait a second. No one bothered to check that. And so I read about some fascinating research. It's not even published yet. It's accepted for publication, but not even published yet. Looking at this link between introversion and extroversion, and extroversion and sales. And what it shows is that strong extroverts are not very good salespeople. There's a way to measure introversion and extroversion on a 1 to 7 scale. 1 extremely introverted, 7 extremely extroverted. And our sense is that, hey, the 6s and 7s, those are the people we want in sales. Friendly, gregarious, outgoing, love people, love talking to people. They're not very good at sales. Now, does that mean the introverts are really good? No. But I think what's curious is that the 6s and 7s, according to this research by Adam Grant at the University of Pennsylvania, the 6s and 7s, the very strong extroverts, they barely do better than the 1s and 2s, the very strong introverts. Very strong introverts are not very good salespeople either. They resist starting up conversations sometimes. They're not necessarily that assertive. Okay? But the 1s and the 2s and 6s and 7s are pretty much equally bad. The people who do really well are the 3s, the 4s, and the 5s. The people in the middle, what social psychologists call ambiverts. People who are a little bit introverted, a little bit extroverted. They're not, they might lean more toward introvert. I definitely lean more toward introversion than to extroversion, but I'm not a 1 or a 2. I'm maybe a 3, 3.1 or something, okay? Could be people who are extroverted, lean toward extroversion, but they're not total wild and crazy extroverts. It's really the people in the middle. The ambiverts, a little bit introverted, a little bit extroverted. Why? Why does that matter? Well, the extroverts are not good salespeople because they don't shut up, all right? They don't listen very well. They also tend to be somewhat forceful, and so they can overwhelm people. And so they're pretty bad at that. Strong introverts aren't that great, but the people who are good are the ambiverts. Why? They know when to speak up, they know when to shut up. They know when to push, they know when to hold back. They're much more calibrated. They're much more attuned. Now, what's curious about this, and I think sort of gratifying about this, especially for those who recoil at the idea of sales and selling, is this. Some of us are strong extroverts. Some of us are strong introverts. But most of us are ambiverts. If you look at the distribution in the population, most people, it's a bell curve.
Right.
So if you look at the distribution on a here's my chart, on a 1 to 7 scale, of sales performance, it goes like this, all right? The people at the ends, the 1s and 7s, don't do very well. The people in the middle do really well. If you look at, though, the distribution of introversion, extroversion in the population, it looks exactly the same.
Right.
And so what it suggests is that, that selling stuff is part of what human beings do. And that most of us are actually pretty equipped to do it reasonably well, because most of us are not on the edges.
That's fascinating. I mean, it's interesting to me also, because I'm definitely more towards the introvert end of the spectrum also. Not a hardcore 1 or 2, but probably somewhere around like 3-ish, somewhere in there. And I found that because I tend to listen a lot more, I think it's really helpful because you can get a beat on the social dynamic much more easily and understand what the conversation is really about than
Absolutely.
if I just went in saying, here's what I got, blah, 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 blah. And I think it also disarms people because you care and you listen. And it's just, I think it's trainable, but I think for me it's organic. But I've always looked at that as one of my sort of largest persuasion or sales assets.
There's no question about that. And what's interesting is that no one teaches us how to listen. Well, I mean, think about it. And listening is so powerful as a form of attunement. The first, the A in our ABCs. Listening is a hugely important part of attunement. Some people, as you suggest, do it organically really well. But think about schools. We teach kids how to read, teach kids how to write, but nobody ever teaches how to listen. And so most people don't do it very well. A lot of people, they think the opposite of talking is waiting. So they're not actually.
This is the opposite of talking.
Yeah, they're not actually listening, and that is a really important part of attunement. The other thing that you remind me of is write a little bit about the skill of what I call social cartography, which is. And I love this because I'm not super good at this, but I know people who are, and I'm just, whoa, I revere you for this, who can kind of go into a setting, and they tend to be somewhat introverted, like you. I mean, you probably do this well. Go into a setting of multiple people, hang back, look around, get a read on the situation, and say, got it, okay. This person doesn't like this person is scared of this person is the decision maker, and can read that, and so it's sort of they can create a map in their heads of how people are related.
Right. It's funny because that's kind of what I do when I walk into a room.
Totally, yeah.
Is I just kind of hang back for a while and I just observe, and
social cartography. It is so important.
Yeah.
If you look at the really, really skilled salespeople, they don't call it that, but they just. I mean, I sort of inductively got to that point by hearing people describe this thing that they do. But it's not an extroverted, Herb Tarlek, Glengarry Glen Ross kind of approach. It's a much kind of more quieter, almost the approach of an anthropologist.
Yeah, no, I love that. So, this conversation is fascinating just in its own right, from a business standpoint, but also when we zoom the lens out, the reason we're sitting here is because this is part of something bigger called the Good Life Project.
Sure.
It's probably obvious on a lot of levels, but I'm curious, in your mind, how does this new skill set, how does selling, the art, the craft, the science of selling, how does that fit into your ability to live well in the world?
Well, I think in a very profound way, and maybe it's not an obvious way, but I think it's a profound way, in that if you leading a good life involves other people, okay? And so you have to have the capacity to bring other people along. You can't do it all yourself. You can't say, I'm going to be in my own little island, my own little cabin, and do exactly my little thing. You got to have people participating. You got to have people helping you out, and you got to draw them in. You have to make exchanges. You have this, and someone else has this. You got to make an exchange. And so, selling is about, at some level, participating in the world, about connecting with other people, about improving their lives as well, which improves your own life. And so, I think at its core, I don't want to overstate it, but at its core, it is essential to living a good life, because a good life involves these networks of connections with other people. And you have to be able to move them in ways that are powerful, move them in ways that improve their lives, move them in ways that improve the totality of people's lives, find ways to marshal exchanges of resources, because we're connected to each other, and selling, persuasion, influence is one of the glues that keeps us together.
So the name of this project is Good Life Project. To you, when I offer that phrase, what does it mean to you to live a good life?
Lead a good life. You know what it means to wake up in the morning, do something that I find meaningful, something that I inherently enjoy, something that I think in a tiny way makes a little bit of a contribution to the world. And so when I get to the end of the day, I say, okay, I had the privilege of this day. Did I do anything valuable? Now, again, I don't want to overstate it. It's not like, oh my God, did I solve the climate crisis this Tuesday? But did I do something that actually contributed to the world? And that's one aspect of it. And also, am I part of, am I connected to people I love and who I care about? And it's really just those two dimensions. Do you have people you love and you care about who love and care about you? And are you doing something that you enjoy doing and that makes a tiny contribution? That's, I think, what a good life is.
Yeah, love that. I have a very similar approach. So I thank you so much for your time. It's been a really fascinating conversation. You and I could probably riff on this stuff for a lot longer.
Oh, I'm happy to. Yeah, no, it's great. It was a lot of fun. Thanks for having me on your groovy program. It's awesome.
Thank you. My pleasure. So Jonathan Fields. My guest today has been Dan Pink, signing off for Good Life Project.